So today we're going to be looking at the new cards for Scoia tael, and the reason for this is because I was planning on and was in the process of making a video on the handbuff Aglais deck, but the new Scoia tael cards came out yesterday, or they were revealed at least, they didn't come out, and they're all about handbuffs, so that's kind of completely pointless to make that deck profile at this point, so we're just going to look at the cards instead. So the first one we want to talk about, I think this is the biggest one, we're talking about the handbuff, is this guy Torque. So whenever this card's boosted in your hand, you boost a random different unit in your hand by the same amount. So obviously this is kind of insane if you've targeted buffs. So it's another way to double up on the buffs. The way you hand buff is good. You double up on the buff points. So Aglais, for example, you buff her and that buff gets doubled via her doubling her own buff. This is another way, if you buff him, you double up on it because he puts the buff somewhere else. And then we have to talk about the last part here. Devotion, this card always starts in your hand. For the record, I really hate this mechanic of stuff always starting in your hand. I really just don't like it. Same thing with Sunset Wanderers, but it is what it is. If they want to do stuff like this, they will. Now, I will briefly point out it's a relic for Harmony, but you're probably not playing this at Harmony. The thing is, though, this effect is so strong just because if you always have this in your hand, you're always doubling up on your buffs if they're targeted. And if they're not, there's a good chance you're doubling up. And the thing is, if you double up on him, if the buff goes on to another unit that also benefits from it, you're potentially getting even more points out of it. So this card seems really good, and for hand buff in particular, I don't think hand buff can ever be super strong. It can be good, but the problem is most of the time if you're hand buffing, you're very vulnerable to resets and Yrden, stuff like that. So it can always be teched against, but this seems really strong, and let's go into some of the other cards here. This one really sets up a lot of the other stuff. So here we have Watcher of the Valley. He's one of the new payoff cards. The problem with hand buff is only Sheldon Skaggs and Aglais that really pay off the buffs. Here's another way to do it. There's a couple other bronzes we'll talk about later, but this is one of the best ways to do it. You give your enemy bleeding equal to the amount this card is boosted. So obviously it's not super strong. If it's bonded, it's damage. That is really good. But the thing is here, you're probably just going to go for the bleeding for value. If it's buffed by like 2 or 3 points, it's not bad. There just aren't enough targets normally in hand buff. Like if you miss your Aglais, your hand buff's kind of wasted a lot of the time. But here is another way to play off with it. And with the bonded out, it's actually potentially quite good. So this card seems good in that deck. Now we have Bountiful Harvest. This one's less of a hand buff card, but it was one of the revealed cards, so we'll talk about it here. Creates and plays a Dual Balthana Elf, a bronze one, then depending on the position of the chosen unit, boost the leftmost, random, or rightmost unit in your hand by 1. So when you create it, you see 3 different Dual Balthana Elves. There are 6. We'll talk about those after we go through the brief review here. But you're going to look at them. If you pick the one on the left, you boost the leftmost unit in your hand. Pick the one on the right from the create screen, as I understand it. Pick the one on the right, and then pick the one in the middle, boost the random one. So you have a couple things. You can either pick the best elf and then take the hand boost. You can pick the one on the side where you want the hand buff, which is interesting. Or you can high roll it and get both. So this actually seems quite interesting of a card. It's also a nature, which is good to point out. You can replay this with Force Protector. You can tutor this out with your Fauve. Well, that's quite nice. And it actually seems pretty strong because you can get Dual Balthana Sorceress. You cannot get Elven Seer, which is one thing, but most of the Dual Balthana Elves are alright. And then there's Sorceress and Whisperer for high payoff options. You could also play this out with Simloss, play out 2 of them, and potentially get 2 engines out. But I think really this is nice for hand buff and more nature decks. But let's take a look at the options here you can create with this for a second. So here are the options you can create with the new card, the Bountiful Harvest. You have Dual Balthana Archer. Now you do create and play it, so you get the deployability. Dual Balthana Archer is not bad. It's just very situational. If you're just going to play the Bountiful Harvest for value, and they have removal and such, this isn't a bad choice, because it's going to play for 7. Also, if they play Necker, you can shoot them down, but this is a decent option. You have the Sentry. You're probably not playing Sentry for Synergy if you're running a hand buff deck, or we're talking about not hand buff decks here for the Bountiful Harvest. You're probably not going to rely on it to see this in a movement-based deck. That being said, if you're running movement with a bunch of nature cards, Although usually you don't do that. Maybe that's an option. I don't think you will, though. This is an option usually probably not going to want to pick. And you have the Sorceress. Obviously, she has the most potential value if they don't damage or kill her and you get her ability off. So that's nice to be able to have. You can create an engine here. You have the Whisper of Dobelthana, the highest potential points, but also the most vulnerable when you play her, just like in any game that you use her. So not a bad choice, but will probably get answered. That being said, if she doesn't, she's really good. Bowman, probably one you're not going to want to pick. Its maximum value is 6, and if there are stuffs in the melee row, it's 5, but it has the reach to kill something that's a 3 power, say an enemy Whisper of Dobelthana, so it's nice flexibility. And you have the Dobelthana Bomber, two random enemies by 2. This is probably the worst choice, although it might be better than Sentry if you don't have synergies. So these are the choices you get from the Bountiful Harvest. And they're all pretty interesting. You're going to see 3 of them, and the option is, do you pick the one that's best? So say you see on the left, just pick these 3. Say you see these 3 here. Left, middle, right. Do you pick the Dobelthana Archer because it's good value and you want to buff your left card? Is your left card not a card you want to buff, so you pick this Sorceress because she's the highest value? Or do you pick the middle one and try and get your buff onto a random unit? It's an interesting choice, and we'll see how it plays out, but I think the card will actually be pretty good. Alright, and the last Scoia tael card is Filavandrel. He has deploy melee, create and play a special card that's Scoia tael with provision cost equal to its power, and ranged one that is equal to or lower than its power. The ranged ones, if he's not the power you want, or if you got buffed too high, you can pick one lower. Obviously, most of the time, you're going to want to go for the melee if you can to get him to set up. And there's certainly some good choices here. We'll talk about what the best choices are here, but it's interesting to note he's another big payoff for your hand buff here. So right now we have Sheldon Skaggs is a good payoff because of the damage. Aglais is a good payoff because she doubles up on the boost. Filavandrel is a really good payoff because you can get a nice special card, and then you have a couple other smaller payoffs that you have, like the Watcher of the Valley we talked about, and you always have the Elven War Dancer and the Mahakam Defender as good cards as well. So there's actually a decent amount of payoffs, and if there's enough of them to pay off the hand buffs get not bad, and they have carryover potential, which makes them significantly stronger than if you're just adding the points, because you can save those points till later. And you can never underestimate carryover potential. That being said, let's take a look at the options you can create here, because you can create quite a few different things, and depending on your deck, you might want to run him. I'm guessing he'll be put in some more janky strategies, and probably will be trying out that as well. But let's take a look at what he can actually create. Here's all the Scoia tael special cards you can create. Note that Bountiful Harvest isn't in the deck editor, so it's not here, but you can also create Bountiful Harvest. So the important thing to note with Filavandrel is, I don't think you're ever going to be making Yorvith's Gambit. We'll just ignore that one here. And there's a couple things we want to look at first. First is Filavandrel at 4 creates you one of these guys. Now, that's not bad. That's really not what you want, obviously, right? This isn't like the best ones here. If you have a Dried Out, it gives you, or that you kill something with Waylay, the most value gets 10 for 12. Not great. But if you need making a bomb, I guess you could do it. What's much more common, though, is if you have Filavandrel, it's pretty common that you hand buff him by 2 from something like Circle of Life, right? Hand buff by 2 by Circle of Life. That's pretty easy to set up. Say you do that. He's at 6. You get Bountiful Harvest, Orb of Insight, or Zoltan's Company. Now, you're not going to really be playing it for Zoltan's Company, I don't think. And Bountiful Harvest, maybe. But Orb of Insight here is really what most people will probably go for as another Orb of Insight. You just put him in your Insight Gourd decks, and you get another one from him once you buff him. The other thing to note is that buffing by 2 is also accomplished on Filavandrel by the aforementioned Bountiful Harvest. You play Bountiful Harvest. If he's on the side of your hand that you choose the Dobelthana Elf on, he gets buffed by 2, he's at 6. And then you get one of these 3. It's nice there's exactly 3 choices here. Otherwise, you might be a little RNG. So Orb of Insight, probably what most people will go for. But Bountiful Harvest, not a bad choice. Makes him pretty good at that point. The other thing we want to consider is, what if you put your Ithleen on him? Well, she buffs by 4. So you're going to get over here to Isengrim's Council, the only 8 provision card. That being said, Isengrim's Council is a very strong card. It searches your deck and boosts the thing you play by 2, so it also will trigger the buff on the unit. acts as a semi-hand buff with the 2 points. You can also Isengrim's Counsel into Filavandrel to get him to 6 for these, as we mentioned earlier. And getting him to 6 is probably what most people do for this Orb of Insight. It's fairly easy to do. I think if you go him to 9, so buff him by 5, say Ithleen and another hand buff, say like maybe Invigorate, maybe you don't have many units in your hand, your Duncan buffs him a bunch. You get to your Svavo Inimda, the deer, which I cannot pronounce. I don't think I would take this option, but you can. It's potential. Now let's talk about some of the more interesting ones. Shaping Nature, also a 9. Your other choice as a 9. Probably pick this one. You get another Echo card, playing Gord. Maybe you want this for the buff. Not bad, but what I think you really want to try and get to is not Novigradian Justice. If you're playing Justice, you're playing in for Mahakam Volunteers most of the time in Scoia tael. Well, pretty much all the time. Once you thin them out, it's not great anymore unless you're playing Pure Dwarves. If you're playing Pure Dwarves, I don't think you're going to be running the, Filandrel, because you have so many high provision units already, and you kind of need tech cards like Uridan or something to actually win with Dwarves. And then we have this is probably the best option here, Call of the Forest. If you get to 10, you create Call of the Forest. Similar to Isengrim's Counsel, but you get to pick the unit you pull out. It makes it better, and you also buff the unit by 1. So I think you're really going to go with the Filandrel I think most people will be going for Orb of Insight. But Call of the Forest is a very good option if you're playing something else. So say you're playing hand buff, and then you put back into your deck your Aglais for some reason, just so it doesn't get discarded by a combi or a hit by the set to 1 power guy. This is talking about a meta from a very long time ago, but the options still exist. And you have Waters of Brokilon here. This is the one that's very interesting to me. If you buff Filandrel to 12, that being said, that's kind of hard to do, but you can do it. If it gets to 12, you can go double Waters again. So what if you make hand buff with Harmony? Now, probably no one's going to do this. We'll try it out, but there's also Yorvis Gambit. I'm pretty sure no one's going to do that because traps already are kind of high on provisions for what they do, which is fair because of how they interact with stuff. But I think overall, Filandrel looking quite good here. And then you're going to have Orb of Insight, most people will probably pick. And then Bountiful Harvest as a secondary option if you need it. I think it's very strong. But that being said, let's take a look at the other synergies for hand buff, now that we've talked about a couple of their payoff cards. First thing to mention here is going to be Enchanted Armor, where you buff something in your hand by 3 and give it 2 armor. It has flexibility over Crystal Skull or Tactical Advantage in that you can buff something in your hand to protect it as an engine, or you can buff it for carryover and hand buff payoff. That being said, it's probably still better to go Tactical Advantage or Crystal Skull on an engine that is buffing your hand, but this is an option, and if you're not going to be playing those engines, say there's too much control, you want to play your Hawker, Smugglers, Dunkas, because you're afraid of what will happen to them, this isn't bad to set up some of your payoff cards. And while we're here, we'll talk about the Invigorate. So, Invigorate might get it's going to get a significant buff from these new hand buff cards with payoff. Because before, if you buffed 5 cards in your hand by 1, you're probably only getting payoff on 1 or 2 of them from the buff. So it's probably worth like 10, maybe 12 points. That's not great, but if you're getting payoff on everything you buff, especially if Torque starts in your hand, Invigorate starts looking a lot better. So let's mention quickly here the cards that will the other cards you have that buff stuff. Call of the Forest, we're going by specials first here. It buffs by 1, and when it pulls out of your deck. Is that relevant? To most cards, no. But to some of them that only require to have any buff on them, maybe yes. So Call of Force is going to also be kind of required to pull out your cards. You can pull out your Filandrel with a +1 on them. Keep that in mind with it. Similar, Isengrim's Counsel will pull them out with a +2. You can use this by shuffling your Filandrel back into your deck to set up the right number of provisions on them. And that's kind of irrelevant to know, especially Call of the Force. He's at, I don't know, 5. You put him back into deck, play Call of Force, he's 6, you get your 6. Not a bad choice. Circle of Life here, it does 3 damage and boosts by 2. It's still only worth 7 for 5 if the boost is doubled up on. But that boost is carryover and it can activate a lot of other cards. So maybe you do run this, and if you're playing the Bountiful Harvest for fun, you probably also do this. For instance, this is the card I think is getting the biggest buff from all these changes. Phoenix has a huge problem where his synergy with boosted Dryad in your hand by 2 and Spawn Young Dryad on a row they don't really work together most of the time, right? You're playing hand buff previously, you didn't play too many Dryads because you had to use stuff like Ithilien and all that. Now, there's still not that many Dryads that you're probably going to be running in this deck, but he got a lot better just because hand buff got better. Is he still good? Maybe, maybe not. The thing is also, for his devotion, usually it was kind of rough to want to fit devotion into your hand buff decks, because a lot of times you need searchers or you need big removal cards to try and keep up with your opponent and not have your Aglais forced out. But here, if you're gonna be playing devotion for Torque, because Torque, if you're playing hand buff, you're playing him with devotion, so he starts in your hand. You can get all that sweet double, triple payoffs from him, moving the buffs around. So good. So you're gonna be playing devotion. If you're already playing devotion, Franksnet looks a lot better, because you can buff a Dryad in your hand by 2. Naturally, there's a couple options for that, Aglais being the most obvious by far. But you can hit some other Dryads, maybe you run them in your deck. Specifically Dunka, you can open with him, boost Dunka, so Dunka lives, very good option as well. And then he always has the young Dryad in his row. He plays for 10 for 8 then, that's not bad. Mentioning Dunka here, like I said, if you're playing Franksnet, probably because you're running Torque, you can boost her. It's very strong because she's already got the Veil. Once she goes to 6 with +1 arm, with the armor, very hard to kill. Definitely a solid option. By the way, I'm not sure everyone will run Franksnet, it just seems like he gets a lot better. As always, Dunka's going to be your hand buffer. You just play her first, Tactical Advantage. You don't need Crystal Skull if you're opening with her, but I'd run Tactical, I think Crystal Skull just because of the other hand buff cards, and she's definitely going to get to work. Now, I mentioned why I'd still run Crystal Skull over Tactical Advantage, probably because I'm going to be running Hawker Smuggler. I'm going to boost random things in your hand by 1. Now, this is a 1 point a turn engine, but 2 points a turn if it's getting doubled up on that buff. So the opponent will probably answer it and try very hard to. The thing is, it's a 6 provision card, so against heavy control, it might not be worth including. Have to do some experimenting, but it looks like hand buff with this engine and Dunka getting quite a bit stronger. Speaking of getting stronger, though, Ithilien really going to get a nice buff here. Here's the thing. If you're running Ithilien and you just put Ithilien on your Filavandrel and do nothing else, Filavandrel gets you Isengrim's Council. Is that worth it? I think it might be. And the other thing is, if you're playing Invigorate, you can go, or any, not even Invigorate, just any of the 2-point buffs. So you pull them out with Isengrim's Council, so you use the Bountiful Harvest, say you use Circle of Life. Ithilien plus that 2 points on Filavandrel means he plays Call the Forest. That's a pretty big deal, because it can get a really big play when you play him. So I think Ithilien gets a lot better here. Some card that might not get that much better is Sursa. Sursa's okay. The thing with her is, she only does 2 damage. So unlike Circle of Life, you can't kill a 3-point engine that's dangerous, like Golbathon Whisperer, something like that. And she needs the Death Blow as well. So she's not as good. She's more of a Harmony card most of the time, but you could include her. We'll probably be trying out quite a few of these cards, because I was making the hand buff deck before, and we'll see how she does. Maybe I'll try out Harmony hand buff, although I don't think that'll be particularly good. I think I will try it out, though. It'll be one of our first decks the next expansion. But let's get into some of the other cards here, then. The last of the hand buffing cards here, well, there's actually 2 more, but let's talk about this one here first. The Freed Sapper, boost an elf by hand by 2. Even if you double up on this boost, say it's worth 4, he's a 7 for 4 then, but what are you really going to be buffing? That's the question. Potentially useful, but probably not. And the same thing with Dwarven Agitator. You need to double up on this buff. This is a little better because the dwarf you want to buff is Sheldon, and there's actually 2 dwarves. You can buff Sheldon or Mahakam Defender that are decent options. Defender doesn't really double up. He just gets his engine going if he's boosted, so still I don't think you'd include him, but good to mention. And now we'll go into the payoff cards. So we talked about all the cards that buff in your hand within Scoia tael. I'll talk about the neutral options later on. But let's look at the cards that pay off those buffs. Sheldon. Now, Sheldon's payoff is actually quite strong. The thing is you don't get him too tall. If you go too tall, you play into tall removal, but you're playing hand buff, you're probably also running Aglais, and you run into that problem anyways. You kind of split the buffs between Sheldon and Aglais a lot of the time, or you just run Aglais as a finisher and go pure Aglais deck. But his payoff is really good. If you get him up to like 6, you can kill basically anything that's a problematic engine, and that's really nice, and he plays for a lot of points. So definitely strong, probably be running him in all the hand buff decks. Then we have Mahakam Defender. Defender is very interesting. He was pretty strong when I put him in Dwarves. And the thing with this is, if you're playing handbuff, you might actually run Invigorate nowadays, just because if Invigorate doubles up on every point it puts out, it's worth 20. So keep that in mind. That is a lot of points if you're doubling up on the 5 buffs. So maybe you probably do run Mahakam Defender, maybe even run Invigorate instead of some of the other leader abilities, but we'll see how that turns out. Lastly then, Elven War Dancer is your last payoff card. This one's by far the weakest. It does 3 damage if she's already boosted when you play her. It means you plays for 6 or 4 with a body. The thing is, just compare this to Dip in the Pontar. Dip in the Pontar does 3 damage, gives you 3 coins. If you're playing Line Pockets, gives you 4 coins, and also those coins are usually worth more than a point, just because how they try and get value from them. A little more than a point, so maybe you don't even run her still. Okay, the last phase here, we'll talk about neutral cards. I'm pretty sure if you're playing handbuff, everyone's going to be running Devotion, just because you want the Torque to start in your hand, just because of how strong that is for the archetype. But let's talk about neutrals here. We have Francis Bedlam. Every turn boosts the lowest unit in your hand by 1. The thing with him is, it's kind of hard to get him stacking the buffs on the same unit. But you can spread them out, and he's not bad. The thing is, at 4 points, he almost always dies. And if you're playing Dunka, you really want to use your stratagem on Dunka to protect her, or on Francis, and the other one won't get it. So I don't think you'll be running him, but it's good to mention here that you could also do this if you just want to overload on the hand buff engines. He's one you can include to do so. A much more viable neutral card, in my opinion, is going to be All God. So you boost 3 units in your deck by 2. This can set up quite a bit of your cards. You can just play All God, and then your Filavandrel's at 6. If you want your, Orb of Insight, you can set up a couple other cards. You can just put a buff onto, now you have 3 good targets. You can put a buff, 2 points onto your Aglais, 2 onto Sheldon, and 2 onto Filavandrel. Before you didn't, that last buff, you weren't really sure where to put it. And then sometimes you'd only run Aglais, no Sheldon, and the last 2 buffs are kind of on whichever units, like engines you'd hope to draw later on. Still, I think you're playing Devotion, but it's interesting to point this out. One thing I'm most sad about with this, though, with Torque requiring Devotion go in your hand, Triss Butterfly just got a 2 provision buff, and now no one's going to run her because you're going to be playing Devotion. Still, you could run her. The thing is, in the Aglais deck I was trying her out because, well, these new cards didn't come out yet, so I was trying that out in my deck, but I think you just don't run her. She's not good. I don't think she's good enough unless you're not playing Devotion. I think you were definitely playing Devotion for Torque. And last, this is just an honorable mention here. Shoop Knight has the effect to boost a unit in your hand by 2. I mean, it's a hand buff, so we included it here, but I don't think anyone's going to be doing that, but I thought I'd mention it here just because sometimes, maybe, you'd make a meme deck with this. So in conclusion, looking through all of the new cards for Scoia tael, hand buff looks like it might actually be viable, at least pretty good, which is, I'm very excited because Aglais was a deck, hand buff was a deck that really needed some help. The Triss Butterflies buff and the Ithling buff did a little bit, but there just weren't enough payoff cards, and now that they're adding some, it's quite nice, and there's a couple more ways to buff your cards. Bountiful Harvest in particular seems quite useful for that, but Torque here, just such a strong card for the archetype. Sometimes you just need one fantastic card. Look at Scoia tael before, they added Simlos and Orbs with Seers. The combination of them, when they got enough stuff, became really strong. Will this be the case for hand buff? I think it'll make it viable. I'm not sure it'll make it strong, but Torque is, the fact that it starts in your hand, if you buff Torque, and then he buffs another double up card, you're getting triple boosts. They're 3 times the value, right? You put 2 on him, he puts that 2 somewhere else, that 2 gets double up later on, that's worth 6. There's so much potential here. The thing is, it's always going tall, so you're vulnerable to tall removal, so I don't think it'd be super strong, but it looks very interesting. We'll definitely be playing it when this expansion comes out. So that'll be it for today, guys. Sorry there's no deck or deck profile, but there really was no point in making an Aglais deck or video when these cards are coming out, so I thought we'd just look at them. I think I'll also look at the other faction cards and talk about them a bit when they're revealed, but for now, hopefully you guys enjoyed anyway, and we'll see you next time.